Sener Akturk, who joins me now here in Istanbul. He's an associate professor of political science at Istanbul's Koc University. Sener, good to see you. Yunus was just mentioning that even today, that Russian-backed Syrian warplanes or attacks have killed 16 innocent civilians in Syria's Idlib province. This situation promising? Are we going to come out with anything concrete later on today?
The most likely outcome of the negotiations between President Erdogan and President Putin in Moscow is going back to the Sochi agreement lines, the Sochi perimeter, as the Turkish side and the Syrian National Army clearly communicated. Lacking that, yes, an escalation is possible, but even then I find it unlikely that the escalation would be between Turkish armed forces and Syrian National Army versus the Russian military forces. More likely we are going to see a repeat of what we have already observed in the last 3-4 days between Assad regime and the Iranian-backed Shiite militias on the one side and the Turkish military and Turkey-backed Syrian National Army on the other side. And as far as we can see in the last 3-4 days, Syrian National Army and Turkey made major advances, and the strategic town of Sarakib, for example, changed hands, even if briefly, within these 2-3 days. So that is the second scenario. If regime does not agree to withdraw to the Sochi perimeter, the perimeter that was agreed upon in late 2018.
Okay, does the regime have that option, have that luxury to say, no, I'm not going to withdraw to this line, even though it's been sort of signed by its sort of main funder, its main supporter,
it's possible.
Russia?
It's possible. That is certainly possible. The regime, along with its Iranian allies, might continue the fight despite a Russian-Turkish agreement. But in that case, as I have said, they will most likely suffer asymmetric, immense losses, as they already have in the last 3 days, in trying to retake Sarakib and in trying to regain or defend other territories they have been previously advancing. So they could do this, but it would be at a massive cost, and it might, in fact, we have seen reports, news about rebellions, maybe not rebellions, but protests in Dera and other parts of Syria as well. I mean, the Syrian regime does not have much military, political, and demographic resources in Syria. So the risk for the Syrian regime is, while trying to retake towns in Idlib, they might lose even more than Idlib. They might all of a sudden encounter multiple rebellions across the country, including in Aleppo and other much more strategic locations. So it would be a huge risk for the regime to continue fighting in the absence of Russian backing.
Okay, my final question to you is, you said that the most likely scenario is that we all go back to the lines, the demarcation lines that were put out in according to the Sochi agreement. My question to you is, why do we have to go back to an agreement that was signed 2 years ago? What's the motive behind Russia signing an agreement and then not abiding by it?
It's very clear, because they tried to see if they can get even more. But I think the developments of the last 4 or 5 days demonstrated that this is not possible. It's also possible that the Assad regime and the Iranian allies wanted more than the Sochi line. But at the same time, I want to conclude with this. The Sochi perimeter is the minimum that the Syrian opposition can accept. It might be the maximum that the Assad regime is willing to concede. And if that is the case, we still have an overlapping consensus. The minimum that the opposition is willing to accept and the maximum that Russia, Iran, and Assad regime is willing to concede, then that will make the Sochi perimeter a permanent ceasefire line and a permanent frozen conflict, which is the most peaceful outcome we can imagine in the short term, at the very least.
All right, Sener Akturk, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for coming on the NewsHour. I do appreciate it.